Okay, we are going to get started with our 11 a.m. session. So thank you very much to Melanie Stafford and Siobhan Vipond, who are here from the Canadian Labour Congress, to share their presentation, Not Part of the Job, Findings from the National Survey on Harassment and Violence in Canadian Workplaces. So Melanie Stafford, MSW-RSW, is the national representative for the Harassment and Violence Initiative of the Human Rights Department for the Canadian Labour Congress. She comes to this work as a community activist and organizer, along with having served as board president for La Maison d'Amitié, Ontario's largest francophone women's shelter. Melanie co-founded Overdose Prevention Ottawa, the city's first unsanctioned safe consumption site. In 2020, Melanie was awarded United Way's Community Builder Award for the mutual aid work she coordinated during the pandemic. Her work is informed by her experiences of living with invisible disabilities and is shaped by liberation and indigenization movements. Siobhan Vipond is a committed trade unionist, intersectional feminist, and proud IATSE member, committed to a fair and equitable world. She is an advocate for workers' rights, pensions, gender and racial equity, and the importance of workers' voices at all levels of government and industry. She has led numerous campaigns on issues like universal childcare, domestic violence leave, and ILO C-190, and Siobhan is the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. So thank you both for being here with us today. I'm really looking forward to seeing and hearing what you have to say.
Oh, thank you, and good morning, everybody. And so just thank you for the introduction. So we are from the Canadian Labour Congress, and it is the largest labour organization in Canada. We bring together dozens of national and international unions, provincial and territorial federations of labour, and community-based labor councils. And altogether, we represent 3 million workers from coast to coast to coast.
Thank you, Amber. Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. We look forward to learning from and with you throughout our time together today. We're going to begin the presentation with an overview of our research, followed by an update with what the labor movement is doing with these findings.
And to start, we want to recognize the struggle for Indigenous rights. It's connected to all human rights work. Coloniality and workplace harassment and violence are interconnected. Whereas Black people had and continue to have their labor stolen, Indigenous people had and continue to have their land stolen. We engage in this work with the knowing that Indigenous principles of interconnectedness, sustainability, and respect for the land hold invaluable lessons for addressing workplace violence and harassment. The journey towards a more just world and safer workplaces for all involves not only rectifying historical injustices, but also fostering a genuine understanding of the interconnectedness that binds us all. So Melanie and I are here on the presentation. We have Steph, who is going to do our slides for us, and we are all headquartered on the unceded and never surrendered lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg peoples. And we are holding particular care and attention for our colleagues, friends, and neighbors on the West Coast who have been battling devastating wildfires.
So the topic of workplace violence and harassment is a charged one. Survivors and victims and people who have caused harm are all in the room with us as we discuss this. I've certainly been all three, and we're very aware that we're sharing data findings that are frustrating to hear. The personal is political. So if you notice yourself having a normal response of frustration for a myriad of reasons, we invite you to sit with it and be curious. It's really normal for personal experiences to bubble up as we talk about this. If, on this Tuesday morning, what's coming up is maybe too heavy for you to carry while also engaging in this presentation, we absolutely understand. If you need to turn your camera off, if you need to doodle, if you need to write things out, take us on a walk, or just breathe through it. Please feel free to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. In the chat, we've shared a link to resources that you may choose to access. Thank you for engaging in this important and complex topic with us.
So we want to talk about what led us to this point. And labor leaders across the country have long been aware of the rampant rates of harassment and violence at work and the detrimental effects of harassment and violence on workers and workplaces. And yet, despite decades of research and advocacy, there has been little progress on addressing this issue, in part because of the lack of pan-Canadian data. And so this survey was really aimed to fill that gap. It was following the success of our first national survey on domestic violence at work in 2014. We at the CLC partnered once again with the Centre for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, and the researchers from the University of Toronto, including Barb McCurry, Dr. Adriana Belligeri, and Dr. Sandy Welsh. And we'll share that report just so you have it.
Perfect. Thank you. So our study was a nationwide mixed method study conducted in English and in French. We wanted to know more about workers' experiences of various forms of workplace harassment and violence, the barriers that they face in reporting, the actions they take, the retaliation many experience as a result, and the impacts on workers' well-being and careers. So this was an online survey that was open from the fall of 2020 to spring 2021. And we had almost 5,000 respondents, so 4,878 respondents. Then that was followed up with interviews that were done in the spring of 2021. So 34 interviews were done with workers and advocates. The goal of the interviews was to gain a deeper understanding of the experiences and needs of workers. Thank you. So who took part in the survey? Workers from a variety of sectors and backgrounds participated in the survey. It's important to note that the majority of participants were female. Most worked in female-dominated sectors, and most were permanently employed. Because of CLC's involvement in distributing the survey, a majority of participants were also union members. The fact that so many survey respondents were employed in permanent unionized work confirms that violence and harassment impacts workers in even the most protected jobs. This means that we need to consider how workers who are more precariously employed are even further impacted than what our results may show. Survey respondents were also disproportionately white, and we did not receive as many survey responses from racialized workers as we had hoped. Our goal and our plan is to conduct further targeted research with racialized workers, particularly Black and Indigenous workers, to gain a better picture of how racialized workers are uniquely targeted and impacted by harassment and violence at work. We found that, so what we know from the research is that it's quite difficult to disentangle sexual harassment and violence from workers' experiences of other forms of harassment and violence. From our interviews, we learned that people often experience bullying and sexual harassment at the same time. The study presented an opportunity to go broader. So we included 3 types of workplace harassment and violence: harassment and violence, sexual harassment and violence, and online harassment. More than 7 in 10 workers, so 71.4% of survey respondents, experienced at least one form of harassment and violence or sexual harassment and violence in the 2 years prior to completing the survey. If we go in more details, 65% of our survey respondents experienced at least one behavior or one practice of harassment and violence at work in the past 2 years. 43.9% of survey respondents experienced at least one behavior or one practice of sexual harassment and violence while at work. And 26.5% of respondents surveyed experienced at least one form of work-related online harassment. So this chart shows the different behaviors and practices that we asked about in the survey. We asked behavior-based questions because they're considered to be more accurate. Research has shown that when you use a specific definition, respondents don't recognize their experience as fitting within those definitions. Whereas when you present them with a specific behavior, then it clicks. So the three most frequent behaviors experienced are the first one, verbal intimidation, the second, spreading rumors or negative comments, and the third one, persistent criticism of their work. We can notice from these behaviors some escalation, and that tells us that workplaces have multiple opportunities to intervene. And the goal in this work is for us to set some conditions where we can intervene in those early behaviors. We also learned from this research that common organizational practices, so hiring, firing, evaluations, management of everyday tasks, the promotion, compensation, management of information needed to do your work, can be used as instruments of harassment, of retaliation, or to silence workers. A pretty poignant example that was shared during one of our interviews was of an admin person who was experiencing sexual harassment at work. She was asked to post a job posting, something she does all the time. And when she returned to her desk and saw the printed out posting, she realized that it was her own job. Although physical and sexual assault were less commonly identified by survey respondents, almost 1 in 6, so 16% of respondents experienced physical assaults resulting in serious injury. These are workers who were physically assaulted at work within the 2 years of completing the survey. So if we break down sexual harassment and violence behaviors or practices experienced, the three most frequent behaviors experienced were first one being sexual conversations taking place, the second being invasion of personal space, and then the third, sexual teasing and jokes. 4% of survey respondents, so that's 195 people, experienced sexual assault while at work in the last 2 years. The experiences of harassment and violence are not the same for everyone. For some groups of workers, there are more barriers to accessing supports. Workers who face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, whether they're race or gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, workers who are also who have precarious employment and who might also have precarious immigration status, experience different prevalence rates. The following slides will break down experiences based on key demographics, and you might notice that we didn't include a slide for racialized workers because of the lack of data that was gathered as mentioned earlier. I want to preface the following slides noting that these are the consequences of systemic oppression, right? So these are the consequences of colonialism, of patriarchy, of transphobia, of homophobia, of classism and ableism. And sometimes when we talk about people who hold these identities, these systems can be made invisible. So when we look at Indigenous respondents, they experience significantly higher rates of both harassment and violence, so 79%, and sexual harassment and violence, 0.8%. Gender diverse individuals are more likely to report experiencing all forms of workplace harassment and violence. This was most pronounced for sexual harassment and violence. So 73% of gender diverse respondents experienced this form of harassment and violence compared to 46% of women and 38% of men. US LGBTQIA+ respondents were also particularly likely to have experienced all forms of workplace harassment and violence. This was most pronounced for harassment and violence at 72%, and sexual harassment and violence at 62%. Survey respondents living with at least one form of disability experience significantly higher rates of all forms of workplace harassment and violence compared to workers not living with disability. And so, of course, there are impacts on health and safety. Workers experience negative consequences due to all forms of workplace harassment and violence. Those experiencing sexual harassment and violence were more likely to report negative impacts. Almost 1 in 2 survey respondents, so 43.3% who experienced sexual harassment and violence, and 1 in 3, or 28% who experienced harassment and violence, identified negative consequences on their health and well-being. One woman was experiencing such severe harassment that she was on 26 pills a day as a direct consequence of her harassment, the harassment that she was experiencing over time at work. In that situation, we lost a worker who had previously been dedicated and committed to her work. One of her quotes was, "I really love my work, I just can't do it." And that was quite devastating to her. And of course, there's also impacts on careers. Workers shared a multitude of consequences on their work and their careers as a result of the abuse that they experienced, with ripple effects across all areas of their lives. For example, 88% of workers lost a shift, were suspended, were transferred, or fired. Then we have lost productivity. Workers also reported absenteeism, tardiness, and decreased productivity. 55% of respondents experiencing sexual harassment and violence, and 43% of those experiencing harassment and violence indicated decreased productivity.
So when we approach a survey like this, it brings up the question of who is behaving abusively. And so our survey found that it's third parties, coworkers, and other employees are responsible for the majority of the harassment and violence workers face. And this is particularly so for sexual harassment and violence. It's followed immediately by immediate supervisors and higher level managers. Now, legislation is absent on workers who are behaving abusively. We now know through research that they absolutely have impacts on the workplace and other workers. So when we look at the reporting, there were significant differences between unionized and non-unionized survey respondents who filed a formal report or grievance, particularly for respondents who were, who experienced harassment and violence. Over half of survey respondents who are union members and who experienced harassment and violence formed a formal report or grievance, compared to only 9% of non-union members. And for sexual harassment and violence, the difference is less significant. 25% of respondents are union members that experience sexual harassment and violence, and then they filed a formal report or grievance, compared to 31% of non-unionized respondents. So in terms of the reporting outcomes, across all reporting avenues, the majority of workers said that reporting their experiences made things worse or made no difference at all. This is extremely important information for the work we have in front of us. That workers are reluctant to report is not really a surprise. You may not be surprised, those listening, from your experiences, but workers who are precariously employed are the least protected and therefore less likely to report. And they're not going to report when they know how easily they can lose their jobs, because there's just too much to lose there. So workers made it clear that they do not have faith in the reporting process. And so the top 3 reasons for not reporting is they did not think it was serious enough, may indicate something about the training being received or the lack of training. They did not believe reporting would make a difference. And this speaks to a lack, in the history, it's a lack of meaningful action being taken. And the fear of negative consequences. The forms of retaliation interview participants told us about were like many and severe. And so we want to make sure when we're thinking about this that we are looking at the idea of like, how can we change this? Because this is kind of, as a union, representative, these are kind of the thing that makes you trigger to go, we have so much work in front of us. So our key takeaways is one is more than 7 in 10 workers have experienced harassment or violence at work. 2 are women, gender diverse, 2S LGBTQI plus Indigenous, racialized, and workers with a disability experience more and different forms of harassment and violence. Our third takeaway is third-party violence. This is from customers, patients, clients, students, etc., is significant and must be addressed. 4, workers are experiencing severe forms of harassment and violence. 23% of workers who experienced sexual harassment or violence reported being stalked. 16% of workers who experienced harassment and violence were physically assaulted, leading to serious injuries. Our fifth takeaway was workers are not reporting. 56% of unionized workers and 9% of non-unionized workers filed a formal report for workplace harassment and violence. But only 26% of unionized workers and 31% of non-unionized workers filed a formal report for sexual harassment and violence. 6 is that workers are experiencing severe work-related consequences. 88% of workers reported that the harassment and violence resulted in consequences such as lost shifts and termination. 7, only 1 in 4 respondents said that reporting made the situation better, and 1 in 4 found that reporting made it worse. So our research was much needed as there is relatively little data on harassment and violence in Canadian workplaces. And this is really just the beginning. The research showed that there is much more to do. We need to use what we have learned to guide future actions and to ensure that Canadian workplaces are safe, healthy, and productive. So as you heard in the last part, session from Valentina, which was a fantastic opening to what we're talking about here, is that Canada recently ratified ILO Convention C190. And we believe that this research can play an important part in implementing this important labor standard. C190 is groundbreaking and visionary, but also practical and actionable. And it recognizes that everyone in the world of work, that's governments, employers, unions, and individual workers, have a role to play to provide and sustain a work culture that is based on mutual respect and the dignity of everyone. Third-party violence is a persistent and escalating issue for women and gender diverse workers in Canada. ILO C190 provides a framework for addressing third-party violence and GBVH. After much advocacy, C190 was ratified and the convention will enter into force in Canada on 30th of January 2024. Now, this is great news, but we will also need strong implementation plan in every jurisdiction or the legislation will fall short. Now, the CLC has called for a tripartite summit to examine the issues of third-party violence, its impact on women and gender diverse workers, and to formulate a plan for addressing this urgent issue as a key step towards implementing C190. Refusing to act is really not an option as workers continue to face life-threatening incidents of harassment and violence at work. We also believe that the implementation of C190 and the fight against gender-based violence at work should be an essential component of Canada's National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence. Unions believe that it's important to collaborate with the gender-based violence sector to bring all these elements together. Both of these challenges can be taken up at the provincial level, and tripartite social dialogue is fundamental to making progress. We hope that this can be part of your conversations at the end of this. So how we're, as a labor movement is acting on the report findings. So the CLC and Western University are working with FETCO, which is the Federally Regulated Employers, Transportation and Communications, to develop resources and tools for preventing and addressing violence and harassment. We have also at the CLC established a harassment and violence working group, which will be helping us shape the multi-year strategy along with the 4 pillars of our work, which is collective bargaining, member education, legislative change, and public awareness. And this is being funded by Employment and Social Development Canada. And this work is really important and speaks to the needs identified by our research. And although this project is federally focused, many of the tools will be applicable and helpful in other jurisdictions. When we talk about collective bargaining, because all forms of harassment and violence continue to pose significant health and safety risks for Canadian workers. Preventing and addressing workplace harassment and domestic violence requires effort at many levels. Collective bargaining can play an important role in keeping people safe and supported at work. It provides unions with a powerful tool to secure workplace support and policies and to hold employers accountable. By negotiating language on workplace harassment and violence and domestic violence, unions also send a strong message that, workplace harassment and domestic violence will not be tolerated and may help members feel more comfortable disclosing their situation and getting the help that they need. Our work since the launch of this report will be to develop collective bargaining tools and language for all unions to use. On member education, because we have a well-established education program on domestic violence at work, which is based on a train the trainer model. We train facilitators to deliver a 2-day workshop for union representatives on recognizing and responding to domestic violence at work. And they in turn receive a 1-hour presentation they can deliver in their workplaces to build and spread awareness. We hope to structure our new harassment and violence training around a similar model, and we'll be starting with pilots of a short awareness workshop. On legislative changes, we want to see action on third-party violence, including a tripartite summit, as previously mentioned. We are reviewing workplace health and safety legislation and government regulations to identify necessary changes. And we would love to see this happen in every jurisdiction and encourage you to reach out to, to who you can reach out to, because in Canada, of course, so much labor law is at the provincial level. So our federations of labor at the provincial level are going to play a real big role in these next steps. For public awareness, we run a public campaign to put pressure on decision makers and advocate for meaningful change. We are raising awareness among members and the public about, workplace harassment and violence, including gender-based violence. The 2S LGBTQIA+ community has been at the receiving end of rising and dangerous hate in recent months, and it's drawing lessons from trans and queer resistance movements to implement safer workplaces for all, and it's crucial now more than ever. This year, the 16 Days of Action, which happens from November 25th to December 10th, will include a focus on third-party violence and labor symposium, so stay tuned for that. And so our future work, because we have much more to do. And this research was like a snapshot, right? Taking in the fall of 2020 to the spring of 2021. We can say that it reflects where that cohort of Canadian workers were at that point. What we can't say is whether things are getting better or worse, if experiences are changing, which experiences of violence and harassment are changing. For example, the study could not capture the full impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the experiences of working people with respect to harassment and violence. Has the implementation of the federal government's, Bill C-65 or future provincial legislation or regulation improved outcomes? And if so, on what types of violence and harassment? And are there things that are trending in a worse direction? So we also want to know, are particular cohorts of workers having success that other cohorts aren't? Are there particular areas that legislation or regulation needs to be addressed urgently, such as harassment from third parties like clients, customers, patients, and workers, working for other employers? How are those workers who are currently facing the greatest degree of harassment and violence able to use tools? And are the employers using tools to protect their workers' right to a safe workplace free of violence and harassment? And of course, how does a workplace culture impact reporting and remedy responsibilities? So we really want to thank the organizers of the Respectful Workplace Week conference for the invitation to present these important findings, and to you for your attention to this issue that clearly is pervasive and underreported. And it's a set of issues that workplaces do not currently have the regulations or tools to eliminate. And so we are really happy to put this in front of you, and thank you for your time. Merci. And what are maybe some questions coming up for participants at this point?
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie and Siobhan, for that presentation. I'll remind everybody here two things. First, we've dropped some helpful links in the chat to reports that have been mentioned throughout this presentation, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint. So feel free to access and download those resources. And if you have any questions for the two speakers, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. I'm monitoring the Q&A and we'll pass them along and we can have a discussion. While we wait for participants to chime in with their questions, I'm wondering if you folks could speak a bit about what, if any, immediate action small and medium-sized employers can do to address the risk of harassment in their workplaces.
I think this is a fantastic question. And, I think the first step is always a willingness to accept that it could be happening in your workplace and you want to take action. And I think small and medium businesses or employers, are not like just because you know everybody, just because that's happening doesn't mean it's a safe workplace. And so for us, it's like working with unions, it's talking to workers, maybe you have a health and safety committee. And so this needs to be on that agenda and on that discussion, right? Like this social, we have to have this social dialogue, and workers are best placed to be able to talk about the experiences that are happening. And I think that kind of, space can happen. You can put in policies, as we've seen in our survey, that sometimes the policy isn't, these people weren't working at places that didn't have a policy. It's just whether it was effective enough. But when we look at that, it means it's there. But I think all of that, we talk to workers, we set the tone, and then employers can start to then set that it's a culture change to say this is not a workplace where this kind of harassment and violence is going to be allowed. And maybe Melanie has more to add on that too.
Yeah, we're at a time where there's social movements that are giving us such powerful information on everyone's right to exist as their full selves in their communities and in their workplaces. And so that's a gift. That's such a gift. So what does it mean to have culturally safe workplaces with a variety of identities? We mentioned rising hate that's happening right now. So what is a trans positive workplace? What is a queer positive workplace? And what can we do without waiting for people with these lived experiences to guide us and teach us? We, in 2023, there's just, we have Google and there's just so many amazing toolkits and resources that exist already. And each one of us can do small things within each of our scope of influence. And each of these small things matter to create a safer and safer workplace culture where we can have these complex, multifaceted, challenging and hard discussions. That's what's coming up for me.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think that remembering that small actions and interpersonal conversations also play a huge role in addressing these kinds of things. We have a question from the Q&A. Somebody's asked, it was mentioned that there is or will be a harassment and violence at work resource center. Is this available yet?
Yeah, well, Melanie, if you want to touch on,
yeah,
go ahead.
Sure.
You on mic? No, that's how you
unmute. So it exists already. It's a website. It's bilingual. At some point, a link may have been shared in the chat. I'm just checking.
I think we're working our way through the links in the chat right now, so it might be forthcoming.
There's so many. Yes, and I come from social services sector, and social service supports ebb and flow in time. So if you know of a really important resource, please let us know. We want to keep that resource center alive and relevant and useful for folks. So thank you for asking.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask another question in the meantime, but again, if anybody here has any at all questions for our presenters, feel free to share them in the chat. We have a few minutes before we break for lunch. So I notice that it seems many employers don't always recognize the intersectional way that harassment can be experienced by people who face discrimination on multiple axes. I'm wondering if you folks can share your thoughts on whether an intersectional lens can be brought into discussions addressing incidences of specific incidences of harassment, even when that incident doesn't immediately appear to be based on a person's race or their gender, for example.
Yeah, this is actually a really important point of discussion. And I think actually this question almost lends itself to see where maybe the shortcoming is in certain policies and maybe why people don't report. Um, it's always going to be about someone's intersectional experience. It's always going to be about someone's individual experience, because two people in the same workplace can experience the same situation and take away a very different, lens in terms of what had happened in that instance. Me as a white woman, I know I need to allow people to tell me, and I need to open myself up to listen to what their experience of that situation was. And so, because it is intersectional, right? Like the same way we have to deal with violence at home as violence at work. Like we no longer drew that line when it comes to domestic violence, is because we are whole people, and so people are, everything in all of their experiences, and so that needs to be worked in there. And people need to look also at their policy in terms of people's like when they come to a complaint, like because especially employers have a responsibility for a safe workplace in the most wholesome way that can mean. And that means that people in all of their identities, all of their experiences are feeling that safe. And so it's going to require employers to do some listening. And it's going to require employers to look at their policies and see where maybe that's the system that is the barrier. If we're not allowing people to have multiple responses to a situation. And also it can change over time, right? Like if someone says something, if it's a verbal situation and it happens, well, you know what, the 10th time that it happens, your response changes. And also maybe it means more, it means different things to you. And so we really need to let the people who are experiencing this really influence how we're responding. Because if we open ourselves to say that safe workplaces is our responsibility, and employers say this is our responsibility, then they should be removing every barrier for folks to feel like they can speak about it, that it's okay to speak about it, and that you'll work through it, because we're all going to have to learn, right? Like there's, sometimes it's these, when we're talking about the people who are behaving this way, some of it is teachable and learnable, but that needs to be on employers to take responsibility.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I've got another question from the chat here. They're asking, do we know if there's more or less prevalence to violence in the workplace across different sectors? So for example, arts and culture, tourism, nonprofit. Do you have anything, any insight into that?
This current survey that we did not break down, like we don't have the aggregated data the way that question is being asked. I mean, the way you're also being asked, we can also kind of divide some workers that they're more likely to be in precarious employment situations in some of those sectors than others. And we know that precarity definitely plays a part. I come out of the arts and culture sector, and I can say that because in essence, most of us we're gig workers, or we're short-term employees, that automatically, because you don't get fired, you just don't get employed again. And that sometimes is really hard to name, because, like there can be a million reasons someone gives why they didn't employ you again. But if you know of an instance and you know why you didn't get the job, that maybe doesn't get recorded and counted. Yeah, so I mean, the short answer on this one is we don't have that information, but we can kind of extrapolate some of the things we know. Also, like when we look at the violence and who it's being, like that third-party violence, which was such a big proponent of it, we have a huge issue in our healthcare. Because for a long time, it was definitely said it's part of the job. And I think we're learning now that maybe it's not all part of the job, like maybe there needs to be some health and safety plans in there to assist folks to work through harassment and violence in the workplace, not just, well, you work in healthcare, so you have to put up with it. So we have a lot of learnings to do. We have a lot of way to go through this, but Melanie might be able to answer a bit more coming out of a different sector than I did.
Yeah, I mean, what comes up for me is the workers that we spoke with just talk a lot about, so in healthcare, access to healthcare by people that experience like multi-layers of barriers. That comes with behaviors that our workplaces are not equipped to manage. And these workers, so I come from social services, from a community health sector. My colleagues who are nurses, social workers, talked a lot about how, well, if I don't take this, then this literally puts that person's life at risk. And I'm not up for that. Like they're literally evaluating and doing the calculation of, I will absorb this harassment because I'm not willing to impact the real cost of someone's life and their access to healthcare. And these are the things that people are negotiating in their everyday, and they're doing that from a place of deep integrity and deep investment in the quality of their work and the access to to healthcare in this context. And that part of workers is something that we need to give more space to and really value and honor, because what we know from our interviews, from these surveys, is workers want to be doing good work. They want to be in alignment with the organizational values. They want to work from a place of integrity. And that part, is something that matters.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that perspective. That's really helpful. I'm going to ask one last question. We have 8 minutes left before we break for lunch, but we can always break early if more questions don't come in from the audience. I'm just going to ask you quickly. I noticed in the report that was shared that the rates of harassment at work also appear to be higher for people with disabilities. Do you have any thoughts on the kinds of cultural changes in education that still needs to be done to support healthier environments for workers, specifically with disabilities?
Yeah, this is an extremely good question, and I think too often it doesn't get talked enough about. And the first thing that comes to mind for me when I think about this is, what is a truly accessible workplace? I think too often we allow workplaces to disable people, and anytime someone is, sometimes the word vulnerable is used, but anytime you have these intersectioning situations, and so to me, it's like you're being separated. And the same thing happens if your workplace is not accommodating folks then what ends up happening is then we're putting people in a situation where there's one more thing that's happening. And so I don't like the term vulnerable groups because it takes away people's power. But what's happening is we're allowing the environment to take away the power. And so it's really on employers to, this isn't just like, because right now, when you're doing an accommodation analysis, you're allowed to say it's too expensive and not accommodate workers in workplaces. And, that's really taking away a whole bunch of humanity out of a situation. And so for me, when we look in terms of how can we support, people and workers with disabilities is, well, first, let's make sure that they're supported in to succeed in work. And then, then we can talk about how they access the systems and the safe workplaces the way everybody else does. But I feel in the work that I do, the first barrier for workers is they have to fight to even exist in their workplace on an in a more equal setting and standing. And so that's what I that first comes to mind about that, is just we really need to change our approach about what we look at in terms of accommodation, of the workplace, and then looking at, what does that mean in terms of the intersectionality and the access for a safe workplace.
Yeah. Yes. What comes up for me is our workloads. So, in theory, I come from a place of trusting that everyone is doing their very best with the resources, the tools, the knowledge that they have. So that's my baseline assumption. From that baseline assumption, I'm aware that A lot of us would like to not have to wait until someone that identifies with disability for us to be like, and then, need to implement things. And often it's the first time that, we've never done that before. And workers have told us what that feels like to be the pioneer, and the impacts that has in their relationship to work. So so many of us are working really heavy workloads, and this work matters so much, and it literally takes time that so few of us have. So this is so interconnected to workplace wellness, to our capacities to do our work and to do our work well. So that's a layer that's coming up for me. Another layer that's coming up for me are trauma-informed leadership skills. So a really basic premise of trauma-informed leadership skill is knowing that every behavior has a logic behind it. So as Siobhan was talking about earlier, with my lived experiences and my identities, I experience my map of the world is my map of the world. And I know that someone else's map of the world might be different. So the work that we're doing, even just the conversations about microaggressions, is a really great one, where as leaders, we're learning about what these microaggressions might look like in our workplaces. We're learning also how to respond and receive our workers' reactions. And like Siobhan was talking about before, sometimes it's like, there's an evaluation in my head of like, that's a disproportionate response to what I saw, which was, in a vacuum, just this moment. But I don't know the accumulation that's been happening for that worker, and perhaps also the accumulation that's not just coming from this workplace, because a lot of us are carrying scars from other workplaces, and then it shows up. So when we talk about psychological health and safety, of course, the wounds that I experienced at another workplace are still with me, and they they serve me well, but also they're still showing up in my new workplace. So and the last piece I'll talk about is when Siobhan was talking about the policy. So that's a win that we have those in place. Another layer for me would be imagining what would be the psychological safety journey. What's the experience of a worker of that policy? So if someone was to enact it, what's their experience of it? So how often do they have to share the story? To who? What's the relationship to that person already? What are the structures that are already set in place in the workplace for a variety of different conversations? What are the containers that already exist, so we can do some prevention, and so that leadership can already be attuned to what might be happening at work? Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. That's a great perspective to have shared, and we're right at time too, so that's perfect.